Just so you guys all know who I am, hi, I'm Xander Pickner. I am one of the build sub-team captains at Team 2052 KnightKrawler. And it's called Funding the Future. It's my presentation will be, and we'll go a little bit more in depth as to what exactly it's about and sort of the structure in one of the slides coming up here. But this presentation is designed to kind of give an overview of some of the things that we found as a team when we were looking this year, when we were beginning our restructuring after COVID, because COVID kind of, for lack of a better metaphor, brought the house down. And so as we were trying to kind of build everything back up, this kind of overviews some of the points that me and the team advisor and some of the other captains came across when we were working on sort of our financial fees and equity sort of side of things. And so when they were asking me for an abstract, I figured, oh, if this is a good thing to make a presentation about, it'll be that, because I have a lot of information. So if it will listen to me and go to the next slide, there we go. Just to start off the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to define equity. Simple Google search says equity is defined as the quality of being fair and impartial. Put in simple terms, it means giving people what they need in order to make things fair for everybody, leveling the playing field by providing opportunities to those who do not have something that others have, so you sort of raise everybody up to the same level. And so that's kind of what we'll be discussing in this presentation. So there's sort of 4 sections. I lumped the last 2 together because they're very similar. Section 1, we're going to go over kind of what makes equity important, as well as what specifically makes it important in first. The second section will be kind of just an overview of sort of the financial barriers and some of the other things we encountered while we were considering what to do for our team in particular. And then the last section is going to be a little bit more nebulous, because the solutions to the barriers that I go over are very much unique to your team and your team's situation. What works for KnightKrawler doesn't necessarily work for your team, and that's just the way it is. So the best I can do is kind of, it's hard to describe what I'm going to do, to be honest, but we'll get there at the end. And then we're also going to go over the importance of some of the big parts of what we decided were things that would be very important or indispensable for our sort of program and goals, as well as some of the next steps after you've decided what you want to do. So I suppose I'll kick it off. Section 1. You could go to the next slide. That would be nice. Oh, yeah, there we go. It lags. It's great. So why is equity important? Equity is important just in general, everywhere, because the world is a very diverse place. Everybody in the entire world isn't the same kind of person. There's lots of different kinds of people with lots of different backgrounds. And the truth of things is you want to get everybody. As a team or an organization, or even as a person, you want to surround yourself with everybody. You don't want to be targeting a very specific group of people and a very specific group of people only because you're not reflecting truly your surroundings. And so as something that's part of a community, you want to reflect the people in your community. And if you cannot reflect the people in your community, then you have a difficult time reflecting your community just as a whole and your community's values. Equity is important to offer equal opportunities for all students. Equity, specifically from the financial point of view, is making sure that everybody can afford to do what everybody wants. And specifically, and I'm just going to really quickly double check something. Yep, my notes, I moved some slides around during my preparations, and so some of the stuff is backwards, but that's okay. Offer equal opportunities for all students. You, specifically in a school environment, which is, again, a community, you want to reflect the people in your community, the people in that community. And so if there are people in that community who cannot necessarily, they don't have the opportunities to be in your team or your organization that you want, that because that the other people have to get in. As an organization, your job, part of your job is to level the field in that regards. A huge bonus of this as well from any organization, but specifically nonprofits, is that equity is a big driving factor in a lot of grants and sponsorships. It does definitely, equity does pay. It's a huge positive. Having a team that is equitable is a lot better than having one that isn't, just in general. And ensuring that all people feel welcome. Again, if you don't accurately represent the people in your community, people have trouble fitting in. If everybody's one group of people and you've got students coming in from a very diverse community, you have difficulty with people feeling welcome and safe and your team feeling accessible. And we'll touch more on that later. Specifically, equity with regards to FIRST is more than just robotics teams. Yeah, we build robots. Yeah, we compete in competitions. We have a ton of fun. But really, our purpose as an organization, the purpose of FIRST as a whole, is to spread the love of STEM education and innovation to everybody in our communities, worldwide, nationwide, families, friends, just in general. And so the diverser your team is, and the more accessible and equitable your team is to everybody, the more you can reach, the more people you can reach, and the more groups of people you can reach. You can fulfill your purpose as a FIRST team to spread the love of STEM that we all have, we all share, and that love of innovation that we all share as well, to everybody, rather than just people who are similar to what you have on your team at the time being. The second point is to prepare a diverse group of students for careers in STEM. Another thing that FIRST does is they work to prepare students to go out into the great wide world and pursue careers in STEM. And a big thing from the professional level is having equitable companies. And STEM education as a whole to a diverse group of people is great, because it means that the people that are entering the workforce in those STEM careers, the people you have educated through your FIRST organization, are a diverse and beautiful group of people, rather than just sort of your homogenous group of usual robotics students, right? Your goal is to attract everybody who would, even people who wouldn't even think necessarily that they would be interested in robotics, right? And educate them about STEM. It also gives you opportunities to further your team's involvement in the community, because equity is not easy. It requires a lot of effort. And some of that effort will cement your team's involvement in the community and make you a lot more prominent in the eyes of just people as a whole. So, and that's kind of a short section because that's just definitions. This is the second section. And this is going to be an overview of some of the points that we specifically touched on when we were as a team discussing what to do for our fees and scholarships this year. So as a student, there's a lot of stuff that goes into being in robotics. Obviously, you need time, you need skills, and probably most importantly, you need money, right? Because everything needs money. If you want to travel as a team, you need money. If you want to build a robot, that also costs money, right? And so money doesn't grow on trees. You need to pay for that. And one of the ways we as a FIRST team pay for that is through sponsorships and grants and donations. The other way is through fees from our students. And so right away off the bat, and I have not gone to a lot of different school districts, but I know at least the way that the Minneapolis School District and the Moundsview School District, where we're from, does activity fees is they are paid up front. It's something that on the day your team starts or by shortly after, you require an activity fee from all students. Activity fees they form an immediate concern to students and their parents because it's an immediate thing. Right? At KnightKrawler, we typically have an activity fee that ranges from $200 to $250. That amount does change based on circumstances. This year, our activity fee is going to be $200. Last year, I don't remember what it was. It was different because of COVID as well. So that amount does fluctuate, but that immediate right off the bat amount, that bill that you must pay effectively directly on joining, is a barrier for students and their families because it's immediately a monetary concern. And monetary concerns aren't something that all families can just go, oh, okay, I will pay $200, right? not everybody can just do that casually. And so right away off the bat, you're already asking for money from students, that's just how we do it. And that's not necessarily bad, but that's your first concern. As a student coming in, your first concern on joining robotics is the activity fee. That's the first thing that we reference. That is something we demand of you, other than you go to our information. And so the exact amount that your activity fee is, and the exact way your district handles fees, and more importantly, exemptions from fees, will heavily influence the degree to which they impact team equity. If your activity fee is only $50, then it will have a much lower impact on the equity of your team and the diversity of your team than if it's $250, right? That's a substantially larger amount. And so as a team, what you decide to place those fees at is important. And as a student, the amount of help you have on the off chance that activity fees are a concern is another big factor. And we'll get more into that later when I start discussing some of our thought processes on how to fix some of these problems, but it's an upfront cost. And upfront costs are immediately a concern to students and their families, just due to their nature of being something that is required more or less right off the bat. Now, not every school district does it this way. I can think of a couple that don't have standardized activity fees, smaller school districts, and I can think of some that do them differently. But this seems to be the way that most of the school districts I looked at handled it, and the way that Minneapolis and Boundsview handles it. So that was just kind of the first barrier we found, was that the activity fee was not a big block, but it was an important milestone to pass that not everybody would have been financially comfortable with passing right off the bat. The second set of financial barriers is going to be the things that you have to pay for that are different. The activity fee is done, at least at Arndale, through the school. The robotics team takes the money for it, but we do it in line with the usual school policy for it. But robotics isn't just an activity that takes place in school. Teams do also travel to attend competitions, whether that means you go to 10,000 Lakes in Minneapolis, or you go to the first regional we go to, which is, I believe we're going to Northern Lights this year, which is in Duluth. You have to travel to Duluth, and a bus to Duluth and hotels in Duluth aren't free. Neither is the admission to the competition or anything else, parking, food, that stuff. That's not all free. It has to get paid for. And so you do that through fees and through your sponsor money. That's a huge cost. Now, at KnightKrawler, the way we previously did it, we covered part of the cost for every student, but it was still an amount of money per student. And so if you are a student or a student and their family who couldn't necessarily, afford to pay basically double the activity fees in a year, because it's usually the activity fee, and then we tended to charge students roughly the same as the activity fee, if not slightly more, for travel in a year. Just I don't remember, I think just to competitions, so just to Duluth. Worlds, champs, if you qualify, is a whole different bucket. That's costs that are definitely that weren't included automatically in our consideration, just due to the nature of whether or not they even are going to happen is a little bit more up in the air, both with COVID and with qualifying. But that's a cost that comes later. It's not something that is immediately presented and immediately paid. That's both good and bad, because it means that even if you can barely, if you can afford the activity fee, but you're worried as a student or as a student's family, there's some time in between those two events. It's not like we drop them both on you at the same time. The downside to that is you don't necessarily, we'll get laser pointer, you don't necessarily immediately have that in your presence of mind. We try to be good about telling everybody exactly what the costs will be right off the bat, but I don't know if every team does that. And so that's the kind of financial transparency things that are a big equity concern as well. The major problem, like I said down at the second bullet point, comes when they're not immediately informed of the cost of travel, because the cost of travel does usually tend to be more than activity fees. Obviously, at least at Irondale, it's usually slightly more. And if we were to not cover any of the cost of travel, it would be substantially more. So just because you can afford the activity fee doesn't necessarily mean you can afford to send your child to Duluth as a family. And so this leads to a theoretical situation where some students are excluded from major team activities like travel because they can't afford it. They're still in the team. They still put in the work. They put in the hours to build the robot, and they worked hard on whatever aspect of the robot they worked on, whether that's PR, they took pictures, or they wrote code, or actually built a physical robot. They've done all of the work, but they can't go to the competition, which is massively not cool, for one, and two, really sucks. And having been in that situation before, as well as some of my peers having been in that situation before, we talked about that and said that that was definitely a major barrier. There's nobody who goes, great, I would love to be in robotics and then not travel to the competition, right? That sucks. And so right off the bat, that's something that's avoided. If you can't afford to go to competitions, chances are you won't be in robotics. But if you don't know what the cost of competition is, that's a whole second problem. Because then you're not even, right? Then there's that lack of transparency. You need to have that awareness. Financial barriers for the student. 3, not all fees are listed, like I said. So even smaller costs for things such as uniforms or the cost of food during events often make or break the feasibility of participation for a student that's struggling financially. They can be an additional source of exclusion, as well as affecting the student's feeling of safety and belonging. Class divide and financial divide is very important, just in general. It's a big factor in adult life and even as a teenager in your life. And so feeling like you don't fit into a group just on the basis of what you can afford and what you can't afford is something that you want to avoid. It does also affect how your team is viewed by the community. We have a big problem, at least at Irondale at KnightKrawler. Robotics is viewed as an expensive activity. Maya, does every team member in any robotics team pay money for trips? Okay. We have a reputation as being an expensive activity. When you say I'm in robotics, people's immediate reaction is, oh, that must be expensive, which is obviously not really a good rep for your school community or your community as wholes to be viewed as the expensive activity. That decreases your accessibility drastically. People who aren't as financially well off as others aren't, they're not liable to join an activity that's reputation is that it's expensive. And when we were thinking through all of these things, one of the big things that came up for us as a team was, okay, we want to relieve students who can't afford to pay their activity fees or to pay for travel. We want to relieve students of that. But the only way to do that is for it to come out of the team budget. And the team budget covers most things. But if we're going to be spending extra money to cover students, we need extra money. And so the financial barrier we discussed as a team was how we were going to get extra money to pay for scholarships or any similar measures to cover students' costs. That needs to be that definitely will need to be a concerted attempt on our part, will be to raise additional money, but the availability of grants and sponsorships to get us extra money is a barrier. We need to go out and find them. What Mark says is true. Most of the teams I talk to don't go to events that require overnight stays. There are plenty of teams that go to Duluth. Obviously, there's a lot of teams at that competition, but there are several events that do not require overnight stays, and I know that those are at least more popular in the cities than, like, say, Duluth is. So having gone over kind of the barriers loosely, because again, they differ based on what your team does specifically. Oh, oops. They vary depending on what your team does for fundraising and how your team handles fees. There's not a lot I can say about what to do with differences because I don't know, but that leads us into the next section, which is planning and outreach. And so the biggest question we had was, okay, we know we want to form an equitable system for fees so that all students, regardless of their financial status or what fees they can and can't afford, feel like they have the opportunity to do robotics, and more importantly, feel comfortable and safe while doing robotics. Like they feel like it's a community that they're a part of. And so part of what we decided was on our high important list of things to do was to make an equity framework. And that's in part with compliance with the Medtronic, no, not, is it Medtronic? Yes, the Medtronic's equity sponsorship grant thing, hard to describe, that they do every year is they require you to have an equity plan. Now, chances are we decided we would have an equity plan regardless for a couple of reasons. It's essential in securing equity for a team because it's a living document, effectively. You write an equity plan and you have a concrete goal, something you want to do. A concrete system for managing your fees, or a concrete system for scholarships or fee waiving for students, something that you can look back on even after your senior class has graduated and go, oh, so this is what they did last year. And if it works fine to do that again, you do it again. But more importantly, it lets you use what your team has done in the past to do things differently now. If things have changed, you can look back and you say, okay, they did this and they did this. So we're going to increase this or decrease this. It gives you a reference, a consistent reference that modifies itself as the need arises so that the next year, the next group of students have something to look back on and draw inspiration from. Because this process of making a team financially equitable doesn't happen in 1 year. It takes years. And so over those years, you need to have a consistent track, a consistent idea that your team follows to reach that goal. And if you don't have that written down somewhere, then you're going to have a really difficult time following those goals. And that was a problem we had, was we had an equity goal, and it might be written down, but I've never seen it. There's no, we don't have like an easily accessible, publicly accessible to the entire team, not just leadership or mentors, framework for team equity. It's also, like I said, it's a qualifying factor in several grants and sponsorships. The Medtronic, one of the Medtronic sponsorships or grants does require us to have an equity goal. They don't necessarily release the requirements for that, but that is definitely a requirement. The other component to ensuring your long-term equity is transparency. I referenced this before, and part of your plan needs to be telling the student and telling the family what exactly your team costs. And that ties in with your team's financial reputation. If you have a financial reputation in your community as being very expensive, but you make it very clear that you have fee waiving and financial assistance for all students, it helps to kind of counteract and start to reverse that bad rep. In addition to that, it has to be clear the degree to which costs will form a barrier to entry at all. If it's not widely known whether or not robotics is an expensive activity or not, it needs to be clear exactly how much it costs and how much you can avoid those costs for students who are prospective members. There's not a whole lot to say on this. It's pretty simple. Whether you guys have an info night or you have posters with information, that needs to be, or not needs to, but there should be information that is included in whatever way or whatever vehicle you use to get the information about your team out when you are welcoming new students or trying to attract new students. The other thing to do is outreach. And that's something that is a huge problem we have barely even started to tackle yet this year. But this ties in with the financial barriers, because all of the talking about your barriers to students and what affects students' ability to do first is all well and good. But at least on KnightKrawler, we have a very, very, very low number of students on our team who would actually benefit from programs like that. The vast majority of the students we attract would not require scholarships or additional financial assistance. The majority of the students we have on the team can afford to be on the team. And that's both good and bad in the fact that it makes equity a lot harder, but it also means you have more money to do things with right now while you're planning on changing your team direction towards a more equitable one, because we do have students who can't afford fees, and so we do have fee money coming in. However, part of your job as a first team is to reach everybody. And if the only people on your team are the people who can afford to be there, you don't have anybody of any different financial standing, that's something that would do to be fixed. And so part of your job is to facilitate outreach within your community. And this might seem like a little bit of a tangent, and in some ways it is, but this really gives an opportunity for, I don't know, it gives an opportunity to analyze the diversity goals of your team in the sense of who you're reaching out to. At KnightKrawler, we've got several running ideas on how to do more equitable outreach. We plan on partnering with national groups as well as some groups in our community, trying to do some equity-centric events if possible, although that's still definitely in talks. We try our best to do outreach at lower levels of education, the middle schools, and to some degree, I've been to elementary schools. Although we haven't necessarily done so with a visible commitment to reaching underrepresented minorities, we just sort of try to appeal to everybody. So there are a lot of ways to go out there and get those kinds of students you're looking for. And those, again, will highly depend on your team and who your team has, more importantly, who your team has in the community and what the style of outreach works best for your community. And this is pretty short, this last section here, partly because I do only have about, I think, 5 minutes. They said to be in your next room by 3:55, I believe, if you're going to the next round of sessions, and it is about 3:49 right now. We did get started a little bit late, but it is what it is.
We will have 5 minutes, so the next session will start at 4:05, 4:05, very sharp. So we'll have a little break from 4 to 4:05 if people need to switch rooms, go to the bathroom, that sort of thing.
So Maya Benson asked, so teams with large numbers of people are not all able to go to the competitions. Do you know specifically how many can go to a competition this year? I do not. I don't know exactly how that works. We've got, KnightKrawler has 50 students. So I don't know how that works.
Maya, are you asking about restrictions at the event itself, like the venue having restrictions? At this time, we do not have any restrictions. As we get closer to our events in March, we'll definitely be communicating that to teams if there are any restrictions, but as of right now, there aren't any posted for. Right, Lori? In her head, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the fourth section is just going to be a quick overview of sort of, this is a hard thing to describe, honestly, because I can't give any concrete plan for you guys. Everybody needs to create an independent plan that is best for your team. All I can do is say what works well or what we think will work well for us in our situation and go over kind of a couple of major points. So I already went over transparency and I already went over the importance of an equity goal. The biggest thing on a team end, for us anyways, is going to be fundraising. And that's something that needs to be done first before you even go to students. You cannot go to students and offer to pay for their fees with money you don't have, obviously, right? Debt is not good. So strategies for raising funds to cover the cost of the equity measures you're planning for will vary based on the community and what immediate opportunities you do have available to you. But communicating with companies who offer equity grants or using your commitment to equity as a persuading factor in getting sponsors to pay for these measures are important, because equity is a big deal in the business world now. And on a corporate level, I know there's been a lot of big push in big business for big equity. And so donating money to equitable causes is something that is viewed positively, at least from the professional people I've talked to, is something that is viewed positive in the professional community. And so it's definitely an important thing to go to companies and say, we need help. We need money for our equity program. Would you consider donating? So that's one way to do it. Your team can also run fundraisers or events on its own. I know at KnightKrawler, I don't know if we're doing it this year. We used to host something called Comedy Sports, where we sold tickets, and then it was like sort of an improv comedy thing. I do not believe we're doing that this year. We also host Week 0, or like Roseville hosts MRI. You can host things like that as well to try and bring in some money just from concessions, sales, and admission and that kind of stuff. The other thing you can do is you can volunteer in public spaces around your community with the intent of raising money by donations. We usually volunteer at the yard waste site, help people unload their cars full of leaves. And that's a great way to both help your community and try and raise a little bit of money for equity. It's not as effective or as efficient in terms of time versus the amount of money you raise as the other two, but it definitely also helps your community the most. But once you have all this money, all of this theoretical money you've got that you can do whatever you want with to make your team equitable, what are the important things to do with regards to the students on giving them the assistance with fees that they need? So again, it's going to be highly dependent on your student body and your financial environment. If the school that you are centered at doesn't have a high amount of students who would need financial assistance, this is not going to be as important of a question, because you're not going to need it. But if you go to a school like Irondale, which is very diverse, though nowhere near as diverse as, say, Minneapolis or St. Paul, a much larger city, we're still a diverse school, and we have a diverse student body who come from diverse backgrounds. And a good way to start off is to communicate with your school district and other extracurriculars. So talk to your school district about their free and reduced lunch program. Like for us, anybody who's on the free and reduced lunch program gets their activity fees automatically waived. At Irondale, you are not required to pay activity fees if you go to an extracurricular and you are on free and reduced lunch. We also have the academic benefits program, which is an extension of the free and reduced lunch program, but the school works with like internet providers to get people reduced cost internet and stuff like that. So the school has existing programs for us to work with. And talking to your school district and other extracurriculars, like if you have a marching band, which is another ridiculously expensive activity, talk to your marching band about how they are handling that, right? Use other activities around you and the school to find a model that suits your community and your student body. Depending on the current diversity of your team, maybe this isn't necessary. Maybe you've already got a very diverse mixed team and you have a program already figured out because you're way ahead of the game where we are, right? And the only thing that is to be done and said there is ensure that your program is flexible. Students change, the student body changes, the economy changes. So as that changes, and especially with COVID, a lot of people aren't as financially stable as they used to be. So make sure that the program you come up with for providing your students with scholarships, be that through just direct fee waiving, or if you offer to pay 50% of their travel fees, or whatever it is you decide based on your community and the models you see around you, ensure that it's flexible and capable of meeting the needs of the student body as time goes on. Just because it helps the student body now doesn't mean it helps the student body in 10 years. And equity is something that's, like I said, it's important. It reflects positively upon you and your community, and it ties you closer with the people around you outside of robotics. People outside of robotics can look into your activity and see themselves there, even if they weren't necessarily very interested. That's more or less all I have to say. I don't have any additional points or any additional
I
barriers.
think a couple questions if anybody has a question.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions at all, you can turn your, unmute and ask them or put them in chat. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Question, you mentioned at the beginning about how activity fees is a kind of upfront barrier because it has to be paid first. Does your school require, or does your team require that payment prior to participating in team meetings or
No.
going to room?
We do not. And this is one of the ways that we've tried to deal with it, and it seems to have worked relatively well. We have an info night, which is in October. This year, I believe it was, or it might actually have been in September. No, it was like October 4th or something was our info night. And the info night is where the students come and we explain to them fees and we explain to them money and the time and what we do. Everybody who's interested can come. Our commitment night, we have what's called commitment night, and that's actually coming up in the next few weeks, or even in the next 2 weeks, I believe, is our commitment night. And commitment night, which is about usually a month to slightly more after the info night, is where we do activity fees. So we actually give the students a fair amount of time to be involved in robotics and come into robotics and feel whether or not the environment is right for them before we have them pay any money. That seems to work relatively well, both in having students who thought they were interested but wouldn't necessarily really actually enjoy it as much as they thought they did. It avoids the inevitable parental, I paid money for your activities, now you have to do it, which is never great. And I think it offers an opportunity for students who would have been put off by the complete upfront activity fee to become involved in the activity enough to measure whether or not they would be willing to pay that activity fee. So I think putting it off a month actually does help quite a bit. There are other things that we could do and that we are planning on doing, but that's sort of how we do it.